Good afternoon. Hopefully you're going to stay awake after lunch rather. Just a quick round of intros. So Anthony Rouse, as mentioned, I've been with Ripple for over 5 years, but I've been in the payment space for close to 20 years. I'm a payments geek at heart. I love the technology, and what I love about sort of the crypto technology was it's kind of a thinking about payments in a context of the way internet was originally created, rather than a sort of centralized processing system that we've had since the 70s. So I love this technology from what it is, and we're going to talk to you a little bit around today around what we're doing in this space from a domestic payment system. And I'm joined by Lauren Berta.
Yep. Hi, I'm Lauren Berta. I'm on the product team for CBDCs at Ripple as well. Been here about 4 months and in payments for about 2 years before that. Same as what he said, pretty much. That was a very long, passionate rapport on how CBDCs really can fix a lot of the problems we see in the payment sector today, but can't say that enough. So it's a very exciting space.
Cool. So what we're going to be talking to you today about is this perceived difference between building for a central bank digital currency and the XRP ledger. And hopefully you'll start to see that some of the challenges that we face from a CBDC perspective are actually the same in the crypto space. And actually, how can we actually leverage co-development to actually improve the user experience really for crypto as a whole? And that's kind of what we're going to be talking to today. So the first thing is, what is a CBDC? Now, if we look back around sort of traditional money, traditional payment systems, they've largely been centralized with single operators or sort of a private operator that's been siloed and creating walled gardens for access to money, access to payment systems. And we all know that crypto is actually a way of breaking that down and actually creating a more open ecosystem that allows for this. And I think what is interesting is that over the time, central banks have started to understand this space a little bit more. They control the fiat currency, or the sort of the money you know today. And what they're looking at here is, how do I create a digital representation of that using the same technologies that we use for crypto? And I think that when we look at it from that pure perspective, it's about them taking a dollar, a pound, and digitizing it in a way that actually starts to get the benefits of the broader crypto technology, the underpinnings of it. And I think there's going to be different use cases. Everybody gravitates towards retail, and we'll talk a little bit about retail because that's kind of where the adoption is going to come from in terms of driving real utility. But there's all sorts of different flavors of central bank digital currency depending on who's issuing it, how they're using it. It could be used predominantly by a central bank to do interbank settlement as today. That to me isn't particularly exciting. That's just applying new technology to a problem that already has been solved for. But I think what is really interesting is starting to open up and bring in an access model that allows a more democratic access to your currency. So when we talk to central banks, and this is kind of myself and Lauren's job on a daily basis, we kind of hone in on and talk to them about, why are you doing this? Why are you interested in looking at central bank digital currencies? It varies depending on geography. So if I look at the UK, Europe, the US, they're kind of, yeah, this is interesting, but we've already got stuff. What is interesting is when you start to look at developing economies that have perhaps been underserved or don't have the technology and aren't as developed as we are in sort of the Western world. And that's really where it starts to get interesting. But also you're starting to see a view of, how do we replace things like cash? In certain countries, electronic payments are really sort of the forefront and where most transactions are occurring. But it varies depending on where you go in the country, even the city. And so you're starting to see a change and potentially look at how to remove the physical cash from circulation. That's actually been, in certain countries, through looking at some of the research, has been something that's actually been sort of massively driven in terms of a transition because of COVID. A lot of stores, certainly in the UK now, are actually looking for contactless payments, even for very small values. Now, that's not a cost-effective solution. If I want to process a 50p or a 50-cent transaction using a card, that's not a cost-effective way. The merchant's taking a lot of hit on that. So the technology is not designed to make it cheap, efficient, easy to use. So that's one angle. What we're also seeing as well is a real drive to financial inclusion. So with this is not just about sort of thinking about the people that don't have bank accounts It's about a broader inclusive model and access to financial services that you potentially don't currently have. So we've been working with a large number of different countries and central banks looking at how do we take this technology and make it more accessible. And one of the critical things with this is if we applied the same thinking to the current model, that creates inclusion. But actually, if we don't think about the problems that we have from a crypto perspective for this, potentially we end up with a mass financial exclusion because of the user experience. So that's some of the things that we're trying to sort of solve for. The other pieces that really are starting to sort of kick in is interoperability and innovation. So we look at certain countries and they say, there's this amazing technology, and what we want to do is actually be able to export experience, knowledge, and create an industry around exporting this as a skill set within our country. And that's huge because it's starting to look forward thinking rather than just looking at where they are today. They're trying to create platforms for innovation. Think about how we make payments today and move money around. That is not physically possible today. We always hear the anecdotes of streaming payments. Try and do a streaming payment with today's payment systems. It just won't work. It's too costly. But actually, it starts to open up a new model if you apply this technology. So I think that's kind of where we're starting to see this innovation. When I kind of look at it, in a former life, I was working in telecommunications, and we weren't putting in physical pieces of cable into the ground in Africa. We're putting cell masts in there. And that creates a leapfrog effect. And I think this technology is a leapfrog effect technology when I look at it on a domestic basis and how it can affect people's lives. So we see the sort of news about the Fed and the Bank of England and the ECB, but actually there's a lot of people, a lot of central banks looking at this and looking at why this is interesting. So this was taken from a site as of May. It tracks about 100 and odd countries actually doing something, whether it's a pilot, whether it's actually launching a project and actually having it in production. But actually, I've seen following research that says about 90% of central banks are looking at this in some shape or form as to how they can leverage this technology. Some are just what I class as kicking the tires, just trying to understand it, and it's a learning curve. Others are far more advanced in their thinking and want to sort of build upon this. When we talk about central bank digital currency, we're not just talking about the central bank itself or the monetary authority that's running the system. It's actually an ecosystem. And it's an ecosystem of participants. And this could be commercial banks as we know today, but actually where I see it is this layer above it. This sort of other fintech or other developers, other operators, other technology providers, providing accessibility layers that allow others to utilize it and create that user experience. And that's kind of this platform for innovation because as we all know probably here, one of the reasons why we're looking at this technology is because it's innovative and it's looking forward. The central bank, commercial bank haven't really done that for the last sort of several decades and beyond. So they're kind of we're at the sort of forefront here of trying to drive through innovation through third parties, the ability to open up this ecosystem and create innovation on top of it. And ultimately, that hopefully will create a better experience for you and I, but also organizations, businesses that want to take money, small enterprises, mom and pop shops. So when I think about a payment system, kind of apply this thinking really to a central bank digital currency. So thinking about it almost in the context of Maslow's hierarchy of needs is you need to establish stability and trust and security with any payment system. And I think you get that, and you heard that from David's comments this morning about the ability of the XRP ledger, the underlying technology, kind of provides for this out of the box. It's kind of one of the things that makes it really, really good. And it also brings speed. So some of the fundamentals about building a payment system and a network that allows interactivity on a financial basis, we've kind of got a really good foundation for this. And then the next three layers are really taking that and actually making it accessible. So we talk about access and inclusion. This is about how do we make it open and accessible for anybody? Because if we create silos, we create barriers, and we want to try and remove those as much as possible within the CBDC framework. So I kind of look at that as these are the participants that want to interact with the ledger, they want to interact with their account. And then on top of that, we start to think about things like interoperability. So this is how do I link one CBDC to another CBDC? It could be to a stablecoin, it could be to some other crypto environment. It could be to an existing domestic system. So there needs to be a way of interacting and building connections between these existing systems, because these systems they're not going to just replace everything overnight. These things take time to sort of adopt, to develop and build out, but also to actually potentially replace existing systems. So what we want to do is make sure that there's really good interoperability, there's good data sharing, and I'll caveat that, within the confines of a privacy model, because privacy is key when we start to talk about central bank digital currency. That's something that gives people the shudders when we talk about sort of the overlord, the central bank seeing everything. I think what we're seeing is actually a slightly different model to that, where something that we're engaged in actively, looking at how do we preserve privacy from an individual's perspective. And I think that's one of the challenges, and Lauren will touch on a little bit around this as well as we go. And then the final bit, and this is really, for me, the icing on the cake. This is the bit that really drives the innovation. It's these, what I class as overlay services. To you and I, this is smart contracts. This is programmability. This is about doing things that are very costly, very expensive, and very inefficient to do on a domestic system, and really provide that hub or that foundation for innovation. So that's kind of what we're trying to drive towards, but we need to get these foundations right by using the right technologies. So I mentioned about the XRP ledger, and what we've been doing as a team here at Ripple is working with central banks, and we've taken a copy of the XRP ledger and made it a private instance to start with. This allows central banks to test, to understand the technology. We do education sessions with central banks to teach them the basics of cryptography, what a blockchain is, all these kind of things that we in this room take for granted as having a basic understanding with. And we run this, we build education sessions up around this to make sure that they can make the right decisions and understand the technology. And we apply this in a private capacity. Now, we are also working on some projects that will actually work in a public context. So they'll be using the public XRP ledger, or maybe a sidechain in future, as a way of actually using that, but actually interlinking it with the main XRP ledger. When we start to think of interoperability, we're starting to create this, what I class as last mile payment mechanism that allows potentially payments to be delivered to into people's hands at a domestic level, but could also be intrinsically linked to the XRP ledger as the bridge between these different countries. And what we're using as well with this is the issued assets functionality. It's baked in, it's off the shelf, we don't have to write anything complicated or anything sophisticated. We get this for free because of the XRP ledger. And again, really powerful. That works really well when we start to talk about security, the model, when we're thinking about a fiat currency being issued on the public ledger or a private ledger. So there's very little or very subtle differences. We've essentially taken a copy of the XRP ledger, made it available in a private context in the immediate term to allow testing and understanding. We have the ledger and we have the issued currency. And then we start to think about, well, how do we use it? How do we make this work for a central bank? And the first context we always get asked about is, how do I make a retail payment? How do I do this? So we've already got a measure or a bar that we're trying to set ourselves up against here that we need to beat. So just to enable this, we need to create this ecosystem. So we think about various different ways of breaking down the different challenges, the different experiences of accessing a ledger. Ripple, we've been building a tool called the Issuer Tool that allows a central bank or a regulated authority to issue a currency and have that and be the sole distributor of that. But we also have the roles of these operators. Now, this could be going back to those fintechs, could be third-party developers building solutions on top of. But these are applications that are actually not built by Ripple. These are built by third parties, built by people like yourselves to create interactivity with the ledger. And then we've got the wallet ecosystem as well. So this is not something that Ripple owns in its entirety. This is an ecosystem that we're building to create collaboration and create the ability for people to interact, to drive opportunity through. And then ultimately we've got the ledger. And because we're running potentially a centralized or a private instance of the CBDC ledger, we can play with the ledger itself. We can change it, we can tweak it. And that's something that we've also been looking at as well. And that maybe also drive enhancements that we can pass back into the community as we start to look at ways of optimizing certain scenarios. So I mentioned about Ripple building a solution. We built a tool that allows central banks in a user-friendly way to demystify crypto from a point of issuing a currency. We've linked it to the ledger. Again, this is not too dissimilar to some of the applications that some of you in this room have built. We've just tried to put it in a lens that a central bank would understand, and try to make it really simple so they can get started really quickly with no code. But ultimately, one of the things we picked up on with this was usability is key. If we don't make this usable for people that don't understand crypto, this is going to be a very difficult journey for us to sort of take. So I mentioned about the sort of bar that we sort of set ourselves against and we get compared against. So everybody around this room, cash is something that everybody can understand, everybody can use from day one. There's not a huge learning curve, there's not a huge amount of friction to using cash in your day-to-day lives. But then when you start to compare it to other methods, so everybody's got cards, debit cards, credit cards, if you have a bank account. You might also have a mobile app for that account. That might be a wallet, so it could be a Venmo, it could be a PayPal, it could be some other mechanism of sending money. And then you've got sort of Apple Pay or Android Pay, the contactless payments through your phone. These are the things that most people can use in their day-to-day lives with a little friction and understanding to pick. That's what we've got to hit. And when I look at some of the differences between cultures around the world, how people use payments, some countries have rapidly moved away from physical cash and moving to more electronic methods. Others still use cash for what are classed as non-payment methods, for things like charitable donations or religious donations and purposes, where they want the most pristine notes. How does that translate to a digital experience when somebody gives you a pristine note because it's part of a cultural thing? So there are cultural dynamics to some of this that go beyond the technology that we need to factor in and think about here. And so what we're trying to do is actually look at the different ways to break these challenges down, look at these problem statements and try and address them in a way that actually creates a really simple user experience for that. And Lauren's now going to talk to you through some of those challenges and problems that we're looking at.
So in thinking about how you utilize your money every day, as I walk through some of these, think about it in the form of crypto as well as your mobile banking wallet, for example. There are a collection of problems that we run into when we start thinking about a CBDC really scaling. And the first one we run into is a smartphone is kind of required to utilize any type of crypto today. And much of the world still has phones like this. When you take a look at it, even 20% of the US doesn't have a smartphone yet. When you go down, India, probably close to one of the largest populations in the world, is only at 30% for smartphones. If you do have a smartphone, the fact that you then need electricity and an internet connection to utilize the smartphone to then utilize the crypto is another problem on top of it. So all of these together kind of lead to the need for offline payments as a foundation for scaling a CBDC. We have you can't see the banking app on the left, but if you had your banking app and all of a sudden, finally you do have the smartphone, it's great, but the internet's down, so now you can't make any form of payment. Imagine you own a bakery and all of a sudden you don't have any internet, so you can't collect any profit that day. That's a really big problem when you start talking about a CBDC working alongside cash. Some solutions we kind of need for this is we need some form of phone payment type that can happen offline. And then maybe it does reload post the payment once you have internet again. And then past that, you do actually, in many countries, need a separate hardware device. And there's some tools we have today that we could utilize differently to make this happen. We think of NFC being our card chip to a point of sale service, and that does require an internet connection, that's true, but you have announcements like Apple saying they're going to put a chip reader in the SIM card. Now all of a sudden, could you have an offline payment phone to phone because you're able to utilize the NFC reader on your chip? Similarly, Bluetooth, it's something that we don't really think of with payments today. It's more an audio thing in my mind, at least. But Amazon Go utilizes this as the way they charge your credit card from your account when you go into their store and then, buy an Apple and leave. They don't have a point of sale physical device in the store. You just walk in and out. Again, that one does lean on the credit card rails, so that isn't exactly offline yet, but could it be utilized in a different way? There's a further problem of who am I paying anyway? So we today have in banking, a very scary banking app with the spooky title, a routing number. And it would be super weird if my friends knew my routing number. And in crypto, it's debatably worse. We need some sort of indicator that makes sense to a human that's more than just a string of numbers. This is a really commonly solved problem in a lot of payments companies. For me, it's easy to think of Venmo. If I came over and painted your house and you don't know my name or my company, but I can give you my phone number because you called me over to paint your house, and then you can just search me in Venmo and you pay me, and that's great. You have this list of different indicators that companies have used to more purposely point at a person directly. And it's up for debate which of these indicators are the best, but it's important in crypto that we don't take a step back. And in CBDC, it's really important that you follow the user experience that people are becoming accustomed to on their smartphones. When we think of an indicator of a person, it does lead immediately to identity too. And we heard this morning, this is a really complicated problem. And when you talk about a CBDC, it becomes even more complicated because it's the government. And the government's not going to let all the payments happen without them ever seeing a payment. But then I also don't want the government to know every payment I make. And there is a balance between those two that we'll need to get to really make this real. So the final problem I want to talk about is key management. And for the sake of oversimplifying key management to its most bare minimum, the key choices we have today are keys held by me and keys held by a third party. So when I come to my wallet, my first inclination is, well, I want to hold the key to my wallet. I trust myself. I don't want to trust anyone else with my money. But immediately, what if I lose my key? What if somebody else gets my key? There is a really cool USB stick that my friends use to hold music. That's actually a USB with a biometric with your fingerprint like you have on your Mac. That's awesome. Now, if somebody else has my USB key, then they can't utilize it, but that also means that I can't utilize any of the money I had there at all. When you start to think of a CBDC and people treating that like their bank account and their savings, you have to have a recovery method. So when you talk about a recovery method, you come back to, okay, a third party. Your bank account today is something you log into. But who else has the opportunity to get into that account, to utilize the key? Am I insured if they go under? When you talk about a CBDC, maybe I have to be, but who else can access my account? There's really just a lot of gaps on either side of this that just need more research for this to be widely scaled. So coming back to this slide, it's really important to think about the problems we see in crypto generally are times 10 when you think of a CBDC. Because when you think about the people utilizing crypto, they're putting in the work to figure out how to utilize crypto. You're reading up on it, you're reading about keys, you're making sure that you're buying the best asset. But when you think of a CBDC, true scaling reaches the people that don't want to put any work into figuring it out. So we need to do the work for them. And that's kind of awesome because you can provide this really great user experience for a piece of money data that the person can have way more control over. But anything we solve for CBDC will be equally solved for crypto, and that's great too. So, and there are opportunities across the board. I talked about a lot of the gaps in wallets with offline payments and key management, but there's opportunities at every level of this, even just at the core ledger capability. So if you want to learn more, we're actively working on partnerships for all of these gaps. We'd love to talk about ways that this could be fixed. They're really big problems and it takes a village. So feel free to come and talk to us after or go to any of these links.
Thank you. We've only got a few seconds, but probably just a quick question or two if anybody has any.
Yeah, so you mentioned previously about how, send money out through a bank app or anything, you'll need a routing number, et cetera, blah, blah, and it's arguably, worse in crypto. Does the XRP ledger have something similar to, ENS as, CNS exists, and that could sort of simplify those things?
We're not seeing that from a CBDC perspective. I think that's an opportunity for us to develop something equivalent or something that is actually usable. And I think not just from a domestic purely domestic system, what happens when I go to another CBDC, when I want to send money from one network to another? So it needs to be something that potentially is universal. So it's say some of these problems are not just problems for crypto, they're problems for domestic payments and vice versa.
So you've mentioned working with governments around the world to tailor the CBDC to their culture and to their environment. We have things like negative interest rates and controlling what people can buy with or their CBDCs. So in that environment, what's the most surprising thing you've learned about a culture by looking at their money?
One of them is potentially sort of friends lending money to each other, or friends and family, and they do it because of the geography, because they don't have access to a bank, and because they may be on an archipelago of many islands. So they get on boats, they move physical cash out, one person draws it out, and they all kind of distribute that, and then so there's no way of record tracking that or making that achievable to actually earn money from leveraging money that I've earned. So there's a huge opportunity there. But negative interest rates, sort of controls all payments, this is something we have to tread carefully with, because some of this starts to step into more authoritarian sort of societies, and it's a balancing act that we have to play here. There's an opportunity to innovate and make things more efficient, but at the same time, it's trying to temper that innovation in a way that actually is usable. And if you look around at some of the research, some of them sort of say, we don't want CBDCs because of that privacy concern. We need to mitigate those risks, and we need to make sure people feel comfortable. Everybody's used to posting details on Facebook, on Twitter, of what they're doing, and happy to share information. Am I equally happy to share the fact that I bought a coffee in Starbucks? Insert appropriate coffee chain. But there's that cultural sort of element of how much am I prepared to share, and how much actually provides information about who I am and what I'm doing. I have to take more questions offline.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.